Welcome to the very first episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast, where we'll explore the fascinating history of Christian mysticism from the early days of the Church until today. I'm Alberto de la Cruz, and I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Carlos Eire, the T. Lawson Riggs Professor of History and Religious Studies at Yale University. How are you, Carlos?
I'm fine. How are you, Alberto?
Good. Great to hear from you, and very excited on this podcast that we're starting.
Yeah, I am too.
This is going to be fun and very informative.
It sure is.
So as we mentioned on our trailer, the Christian Mysticism Podcast is going to explore Christian mysticism from its origins to its definition to different Christian mystics that are out there, as well as mystics from other religions, and how it all ties together from the origin of the church to the church today. But I think one of the most important things, Carlos, is for us to get a definition of what Christian mysticism is. And who better to provide it than yourself?
Sure. It's a relatively new term, the way that it's used and how people interpret it, and it's often misunderstood. The most basic definition is that mysticism refers to these religious experiences, which you can find in most religions around the world in human history. These experiences where the individual has a very, very overwhelming experience of the divine. Another way of saying that is a personal encounter with the divine.
So Christian mysticism is not necessarily that someone has certain powers or a stigmata or something of that nature, that they're performing miracles. It could also mean just that personal and unexplained experience with God, correct?
That's right. And of course, you can also have mystics that have stigmata and who levitate and bilocate and have all these other physical phenomena associated with these experiences.
And I'm really looking forward into getting to those stories.
But that's not, mysticism, it's best to think of it on a spectrum, right? There's very mild mysticism at one end, which most religious people have. I mean, at the sort of low end of the spectrum, it's more about feeling. So you can have a mystical experience, which is a feeling as one prays, a feeling of closeness to God. That's on the mystical spectrum. But there are more intense sorts of experiences that, the spectrum continues all the way to extreme ecstasies. And everything in between those two ends of the spectrum could be called mysticism. But technically speaking, it's a term invented by scholars in the 19th century. And these 19th century scholars wanted to have a term that could be used for all religions. Now, if we want to understand why scholars came up with this term, it is that the term mystic or mystical in English is derived from a Greek word that is related to the verb to hide, or the noun secret, because in its origins, the use of this word in Greek, myo, was something closed, something that only certain people can access. So what scholars did in the 19th century is they didn't actually speak of it as a spectrum. That's something that's developed later in the study of mysticism. But the bottom line is, it's about crossing over. It's about crossing over from normal sense perception and linear reasoning to an experience of the divine directly.
It's like
And
being able to move into the dimension, for lack of a better term, where God exists,
that's right.
as opposed to the worldly realm which we all live in. It's almost like a window or
it's a window or a portal.
a portal. Yeah, that was the other word I was looking for. A portal
Yeah,
into God's
into
heavenly domain that
right.
we can't even begin to imagine.
That's right. Supernatural realm.
Exactly.
And of course, it gets very complicated after that. But if I can use one example of a, a Christian in the 17th century, a very smart man, Blaise Pascal, who invented the world's first calculating machine. He was the one who figured out that you can measure air pressure. He's a mathematician and a genius, who had a mystical experience in the year 1654, and he wrote about it. He wrote it on a piece of parchment, sheepskin, and then had it sewn into one of his coats. And this was not discovered till after his death. But here's what he wrote, and it's all very poetic and very very much an expression of feeling. And it begins like this, and translating from the French: Fire, God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not of the philosophers. Certitude, certitude, feeling, joy, peace. And it goes on from there.
Wow.
Uh, and Pascal is known for many of his sort of pithy sayings. And one of them is, the heart has its reasons, which reason cannot know. This is one of the smartest men of the 17th century, one of the smartest men in human history, actually.
I
And
mean, if you really look at it, throughout history and the great minds and scientists and intellectuals and philosophers that have tried to sort of figure out religion and figure out God and figure out that whole realm, I'd say one of the problems some of them confronted were trying to look at it from a human perspective, as opposed to a spiritual perspective.
well, yeah, and that's it's again back to a very basic bottom line. It's about experiencing another dimension while you're in this material dimension that we all call reality, right? The natural, real world. But what most mystics, and not just in Christianity, but in other religions too, what they claim is that there's another dimension that is more real than this because it's eternal. And
Yeah, that
time is time is left behind along with material perception.
that
So
that's always been one of the most puzzling and bewildering things to me about thinking about heaven and God and the dimension is just how it's outside of time, and for us humans to think and to reason and to perceive anything outside of linear time it's I would say it's impossible for me.
right,
And I've always felt, for many years, I've always felt that time was, God's fishbowl for us. That's He keeps us in a fishbowl of time. And once we get out of that, but when you think about the mystics and they get a peek into that, I couldn't even begin to imagine what it
well,
must feel like
and
to see something so grand.
what all mystics in all religions say about their experiences is that human language fails. You cannot really explain it. You can just do something like what I just read from Pascal, right? You can hint at what is perceived when one crosses over. Or actually, many of them speak, it's not that the person crosses over, It's that the supernatural sort of breaks through to you. It's a simultaneous thing. It's a two-way street, right? And language fails. And in later podcasts we can dwell on that, because that is so much a central part of what every mystic says when they write or speak about their crossing over to the supernatural. And
And
what
speaking of no, speaking of crossing over, it kind of brings to mind people that have claimed to have had near-death experiences where they go to heaven or they see Jesus or angels or God and sort of tour. Would you classify that to be in in the same area, in the same realm
well,
as what mystics see?
I think so, but one has to be careful about this, because these near-death experiences, which are so well documented, they run the gamut from the very sort of fictionalized version of that other dimension as very similar to this dimension, to others that try to describe something which they keep telling you is indescribable.
Yeah, it's almost like they're portraying it in a human way. It's you read these near death experiences, and I went through a tunnel, I saw a light, I walked through
Right,
the tunnel, was taken by the hand, I was
right,
taken here, so it's sort of in a it's described in a way that we can understand as humans, which you bring up a good point. It makes you wonder just how the veracity of these accounts, or who's exactly behind it.
right.
But sort of similar, how do apparitions fall into this?
Oh, this is again. Uh, there are technical terms used by scholars, and then there are technical terms used by each Christian church. So apparitions are very much part of Catholic and Orthodox Christianity. And an apparition is distinguished from a mystical experience in various ways, but the most important one is that an apparition is some kind of divine apparition or heavenly apparition. And then within Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, it could be Jesus who appears. It could be the Virgin Mary who appears. In much rarer occasions, some saint who is in heaven appears. But the person who receives this apparition did not necessarily prepare for it. It just is a surprise. And if you read any apparition account, it's always, people being surprised.
Right.
And in the Catholic tradition, especially beginning in the late Middle Ages, so, beginning in the 15th century, 16th, 17th, then it intensifies. You have a growing number of apparitions, and those who see these apparitions, many of them, end up being children, because and then there's a linkage made in the Catholic tradition between the innocence of children that makes them more receptive to these apparitions than adults, because innocence has a lot to do with these apparitions. And if I could just sort of go back to mysticism for a second, one of the differences between mysticism and an apparition, which some people use the term interchangeably, vision or apparition. Somebody has a vision of the Virgin Mary, the Virgin Mary appears and it's an apparition. Those two terms are used very loosely and sometimes interchangeably. But the main difference between mysticism is that it's linked to a lifestyle, to a very certain kind of life devoted to prayer. People who have done something or keep doing something to bring themselves close to God. So they prepare themselves for these experiences, right? whereas a vision or apparition can happen to someone unexpectedly.
Right. So, I mean, I think it's good we're talking about this because we not only learn what mysticism is, we're also learning what mysticism isn't.
That's right.
So
And
there's so many things that people, lay people such as myself would kind of classify under mysticism, but it really doesn't fall under mysticism because mystics, at least what I've read in the past, they're almost seeking it out, almost
yes,
working towards that goal of developing a relationship with God, with Christ, that's so close that they touch.
that's right.
So it's as opposed to I keeps coming to mind as we were talking about apparitions and things of that nature. Of recently saw that film Father Stew, and I don't know if you've had a chance to see it.
No, I haven't. No.
But it's a true story, and in one scene he was involved in a really bad accident, and it's a miracle that he survived. But the Virgin Mary came to him and told him, it's not your time. You have some things to do.
Huh.
And that was a life-changing moment for him. He was struggling whether he was converting to Christianity, to Catholicism, and didn't know which way to go. But that moment was a watershed moment for him, and that's what completely changed his life. But he wasn't seeking it out. He just happened to get into a really bad accident, and as he laid there on the ground thinking he was going to die, the Virgin Mary came and told him, no, it's not time.
Well, that's close to a near-death experience from the
That
one.
could,
one-
yeah,
the
that
ones
could
I
be
have
it
read.
too.
Yeah. But the fact remains that this applies to all major religions. Mysticism is tied to a very specific kind of life, which involves two things especially. One is prayer, right? So you're already starting a dialogue. You enter into a regular sort of dialogue with the divine through prayer. So in that respect, all Christians who pray are involved in sort of that lower end of the spectrum, mysticism. And the other element that is globally a part of mysticism in religion is self-denial of some kind. And what do I mean by self-denial? Self-denial, which involves, fasting and being very careful about one's behavior. There is no such thing in the mystical tradition as someone who is living a very materialistic, dissolute life who suddenly has a mystical experience. Right?
Yeah,
It's just not. It's not. It doesn't happen that way.
Despite what you see in the movies and
That's right.
and reading books.
But for instance, for those who are familiar with the New Testament, the story of Paul or Saul, who was persecuting Christians right after the death and resurrection of Jesus.
The road to Damascus.
Saul is a very, very pious Pharisee, a Jew, a Jewish Pharisee who doesn't like Jesus's followers. He thinks that they're all, heretics. So he's persecuting them. And on his way to Damascus, he gets knocked off his horse by a vision of Jesus. Jesus appears to him and says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And of course, he becomes a Christian. He joins the Christians. But he was not prepared for that. But you have to take into the context that he was a very pious Pharisee. He already had a relationship with the divine. And that is made very clear in the Acts of the Apostles. And Paul also makes it very clear in his letters and his epistles that he already had a relationship with God, but he was just mistaken. He was wrong. And Jesus shows up and tells him, Saul, why are you doing this? This is all wrong. Why do you persecute me? And it takes them a while to become a member of the Christian community because they don't trust him. But he also says in his letters that, he never saw Christ Jesus in the flesh. He only saw him after the resurrection and ascension. But he counts his encounter with Christ on the road to Damascus as a real encounter. And he knew him. He got to know Jesus personally. Jesus crossed over into this dimension to straighten him out. And I get this question all the time. Well, why doesn't Jesus do that to everybody?
Yeah,
it's a good question. It's a very
I don't know. Every time and I've wondered that too, and I always think about that quote from C.S. Lewis that man seeking God to see God is like a mouse seeking to see a cat. It's like be careful what you ask for.
Oh yeah,
God is
absolutely.
He's way more powerful than we can even start to begin to imagine, and be careful wanting to be in his presence. And you look throughout the Bible, every time with Moses and other characters in the Bible, when they've come across God, that they've fall to the ground, put their face to the ground. They can't stand, they can't bear to look at the upon the face of God.
And it's terrifying. And actually, throughout the Bible, when angels appear to people, usually the first thing they say is, "Don't be afraid."
Right.
Don't be terrified. This is good. Please calm down. Yeah. Well, there's one mystic, 15th century Catherine of Genoa. We can come back to her in another podcast, but she had something to explain that it sums up what we've been discussing just now, sums it up so perfectly. And it is this, she said: a soul, that is a person. Let's be a little more basic. A person who has been living the wrong kind of life, if they were to be placed in God's presence, would be totally crushed by the experience because of the distance between them and the divine, because the divine is all goodness. And if one has led a life that is just not all that good, and one comes in the presence of the divine, which is ultimate goodness, the experience would be devastating. And actually, I don't want to bring this up now as something to go down the road, the notion of purgation or cleansing, which is linked to the Catholic teaching of purgatory. Actually, what she was saying when she said what I just related, she was speaking about souls in purgatory, Catholic belief. She said, a soul in purgatory who has not been fully cleansed will not want to leave purgatory, because going to God's presence in an impure state would be devastating. Which brings me to this very basic point about mysticism, and more specifically, the tradition of mysticism in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions. Again, it's a process and a spectrum. It's both of those things. It's a process and a spectrum. And the process is three basic steps. The first step, in order to enter into that spectrum, the first step is purgation or cleansing, getting rid of one's nastiness. And how do you do that? Well, you do that by, self-denial, because actually, the root of all sin or bad behavior is selfishness. So purgation is step number one. Then step number two is that you begin to break through to that other dimension, or that other dimension begins to break through to you. And that stage is illumination, right? Your mind is illumined. Things get clearer, brighter for you because you go into that other dimension. And the third and final step, which in the Catholic and Orthodox tradition is considered to be always a temporary kind of experience, is union, right? A very, very close union with the divine, which comes and goes. Everyone says that.
Yeah, I mean, you don't get. I guess you cross over permanently when your body is over, you die, and
That's
your
right.
soul. But I can't imagine it's a permanent place where you can stay and or spend most of your time there, and because that's not. I would imagine that's not the purpose God
Well, not
has
only
for us.
right, because mysticism, which again, I keep saying this, I know, but it's very important to keep in mind that it's not just Christians who have mystics. But I think it's very, very important to realize that this is a common human experience, right? So if you're going to be very scientific about it, and scientific not just in terms of social science like anthropology, but scientific in terms of biology and even chemistry and medicine, is the fact that these unitive experiences that Christians talk about and other religions also, mystics speak of these, there's unitive experiences, is that if you're there for too long in that state, your body will cease to function. In other
Wow.
words, you'll die. So
Yeah, your body wasn't built to be
that's right.
living in that realm.
That's right.
And
Yes. Yeah.
and I know our podcast is called the Christian Mysticism Podcast, but I think it's important as we try to understand and learn and get a better grasp of what Christian mysticism is to address and one of the topics that we'll be discussing in future episodes is that mysticism is not just a phenomenon among Christians. Other religions have those as well.
Right. And there are scholars actually who prefer to speak of mysticisms in the plural rather than mysticism, because we can come back to this theme or not, which is, what are the similarities and what are the differences between the mystical experiences of, let's say, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian. Yeah, they're very different experiences, but they do have some things in common. And
what would you say some of those things are?
Well, one of them is, the feeling. One of them is feeling. It's there's an emotional dimension, and the other is actually physical changes that can take place while in ecstasy. And the ecstatic experience is something that is common. So let's leave it at that for now. This mysticism is all about having ecstatic experience. And what does ecstasy mean? It means that you're out of your body. Ecstasy, the Greek word, is standing outside yourself. And that is the mind or the soul or the spirit or whatever it is that experiences the other, the supernatural. It's not the only thing experiencing the supernatural, it's also the body, because we are embodied. And this is a common thread that runs through. And again, we can come back to this later, but scientists have done research on the human brain. Neurologists have researched and found where in the human brain religious experience can be located. All right, it's that specific. There's a part of our brain that's the religious part. And there are a couple of scientists who have developed this, and it's a fascinating subject in testing, actually, wiring up people while they're praying, for instance. There's a famous study carried out with Carmelite nuns who were wired up. They put electrode things on their skulls, like everyone gets when they have an electrocardiogram.
Right.
And they mapped out where their brains were most active when they were in prayer. And that's only one of many such experiments that have been carried out. At the more extreme end of this experimentation, there were these neurologists who devised what they called the God helmet, right? And it was a helmet with all the electrode things on it in the right spots. And they through electromagnetic stimulation, could evoke religious experiences in most of the people who wore the helmet.
Interesting.
So it
that sounds like the topic for an episode just
yes,
on the God helmet.
Yes, yeah, which is fascinating. But my point is, the reason I bring it up, in the very first chat that we're having, is not to distract anyone from the subject of what mysticism is, but to actually bring into the discussion the fact that in mysticism there is always some kind of interplay between the physical and the spiritual. But the physical can't be left out, because that's who human beings are. We are physical beings. So therefore, the fact that there is some kind of meeting point in the human brain for the spiritual and the material, or the natural and the supernatural, it simply means that, the human brain is equipped to go into that other dimension. But it simply can't stay there. It cannot stay there for very long.
And speaking of the physical realm, I know mysticism has been around. There's famous cases, and that we'll get into in future episodes. But a lot of non-believers, atheists, people that are trying to find a human explanation for a supernatural event may believe that these people are suffering psychological episodes or schizophrenia. Yeah. The voices that they hear are they're actually schizophrenic and things of that nature.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As a matter of fact, as a quip by Bertrand Russell, the mathematician and philosopher who was an atheist, and actually authored a book titled Why I Am Not a Christian. Bertrand Russell says, I see very little difference between men who eat too little and see angels, and men who drink too much and see snakes. But it can also, mysticism can always be pathologized and turn into some kind of mental illness. And it might help now. See, if you just do a little bit of searching in dictionaries for the definitions of mysticism, you can find many sort of negative definitions. And I'll just read 4 picked from various dictionaries, right? And I won't say which dictionaries.
Okay.
But the first one is, this definition: belief that union with or absorption into the deity or the absolute, or the spiritual apprehension of knowledge inaccessible to the intellect, may be attained through contemplation and self-surrender. That's a good definition. The second one is mysticism: belief characterized by self-delusion or dreamy confusion of thought, especially when based on the assumption of occult qualities or mysterious agencies. Number 3, mysticism is the belief that direct knowledge of God, spiritual truth, or ultimate reality can be attained through subjective experience, such as intuition or insight. And then the most insulting of all, number 4, and some people use it this way. Number 4, mysticism is vague speculation, a belief without sound basis.
Yeah, well, I wonder if the person who wrote that is atheist.
I wonder. I wonder. But, I had this experience once with a student. And I was teaching my mysticism class at the University of Virginia. I mentioned in the first lecture, I always used to say this in the first lecture, these people we're going to be reading are very unusual people, and they might be the kind of people you don't want to sit next to on a bus because they see things that other people don't see. I thought that was a funny way of introducing how weird mystics can be.
I can only imagine from someone who knows a mystic, like the Friends of Saint Teresa de Avila, and what it would be like to know her and speak to her, and understanding everything that she's seen and everything that she's gone through and everything she's experienced. But also, I think it's fascinating to think, when you are a mystic and you have seen the other side and you have seen things that no other, very few other humans have ever seen, except for other mystics, and you've seen these incredible, horrifying and awe-inspiring visions and conversations, you have to wonder how they view their fellow humans after that.
Well,
like and their surroundings.
yes.
It's like, sort of like living in a thatch roof hut with dirt floors, and then you get to go into the mansion and enjoy a big buffet and swim in the pool and enjoy all the trappings, and then you got to go back to live in the hut.
Yes, and this is why Teresa, Saint Teresa, wrote a poem where the refrain used in every stanza is "Me muero porque no muero." I die because I'm not dying. Or another way of translating it, I'm dying to die.
Yeah, I mean, once
Me
you see
muero
it, why
porque no muero.
why
Yeah,
do you want to go back to
that's right.
to
Oh,
this?
and then
And
she refers to the body. When you come back, she refers to it as a prison, or like having a large, heavy chain around you. So,
and she suffered a lot of health issues.
oh yeah, she did. And there's actually nobody has diagnosed what was wrong with her, but she was totally paralyzed for a while. And at one point, her family thought she was dead. They were having the wake, right? And back then
Wow.
there were no funeral homes, so the wakes were held in people's houses. And this is kind of funny because they had actually put up how could you tell people were dead in the 16th century without electronic medical equipment? They put a mirror under her nose to see if it would fog up, right? And as far as they could tell, she was not breathing. So during the wake, someone in the room fell asleep, knocked over a candle, and a curtain caught on fire. And at that moment, Teresa woke up from her coma and terrified everybody in the room because they thought she was dead. And her recovery was very, very, very slow and very painful.
I wonder, going back to something you mentioned a little while ago about spending so much time in that other realm, in the presence of God or close to the presence of God, and how it affects the human body. I wonder, because she had some very intense experiences, and
yes, she did.
And you wonder if that was the source of her ailment, her body just suffering the consequences of spending so much time or having such intense experiences with God.
Well, this illness I was speaking about and her death, right, or what her family thought was her death. This all happened before she started having mystical experience. These predate all of her
Oh
mystical.
wow! I thought it had taken place after.
Nope. The wake that was being held. She was living in a convent, but she was not having mystical experiences. She was still a teenager, basically, or in her early 20s, and she had to be taken out of the convent because her father was desperate and seeking out doctors, and doctors just kept making her worse and worse and worse. But no, after she started having mystical experiences, she would have other bodily phenomena that she described in several places as extreme pain. And after these mystical ecstasies, she said that her entire body hurt, and that her hands actually hurt so much that she couldn't pick up the feather with which she was writing, because of course back then, you wrote with quills. So even picking up something as light as a feather was too much for her hand to handle.
Interesting.
But
so maybe it did have some effect.
Oh yeah,
definitely on her body.
And actually, the way that her death was interpreted is worth bringing up now, because she died from a hemorrhage. She hemorrhaged to death, and all sorts of retroactive diagnoses have been offered. That maybe she had uterine cancer or ovarian cancer. But whatever it was, the way it was interpreted was, because she bled so profusely, was that she had a mystical experience that was so intense, and that her body just could not take it. In other words, she went into an ecstasy from which she did not emerge.
So it ended up killing her body, which
she wanted very much.
Right, which based on her poem is exactly what she wanted. And
yep. Yes.
She may have even done it on purpose.
Well, that's another thing, though, if I could stop you on that point.
Sure.
In the Catholic and Orthodox Christian mystical tradition, the individual does some things, but the individual cannot actually bring these things on. It is always considered a gift. As a matter of fact, in Spanish, so Teresa called them favores. It's a favor, un favor. So, she just went into that final ecstasy. She was already very ill and very weak, because, her nuns didn't always have enough food to eat. They were that poor. You can focus on the physical to the point that there's an article that appeared in 1982 that diagnosed Teresa as having temporal lobe epilepsy, because so many of her symptoms match those of temporal lobe epilepsy. So again, you can pathologize, you can make it a medical, you can make it a physiological, medical kind of experience. And of course, with epilepsy too, it's not something anybody can control. It just happens. You have your seizures. So that's another reason that this article argued that she might have had temporal lobe epilepsy. But since this was published in the Catholic Historical Review, the conclusion was, well, even if she did have temporal lobe epilepsy, what matters most is not that she had this ailment, but it's what she did with it.
Well, her writings, I think, are a testament to what she experienced, and if that was temporal lobe epilepsy, it gave her some incredible
That's right.
visions and
Yes,
experiences.
it's what you do with it. It's what you do with it.
Exactly.
Which brings me back to what I used to tell my class during the first lecture. You don't want to sit next to mystic on the bus.
Exactly.
One year, a student came up to me. Student I knew because she had taken 2 other courses from me before. And she was a brilliant student. And every professor that had her in a class just loved her because she was so brilliant. But she came up after class, and since she knew me already, she could say this to me. She said, "Professor, you really offended me with that comment about the bus." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I see things that other people don't see all the time."
Wow.
Yeah. So if she was some kind of psychotic, right, as critics might say, "Oh, this is all psychosis," she was a highly functional psychotic, more highly functional than people who were not. So
Right.
that taught me a lesson. It really did. And I don't know I can't remember what her religious tradition was. It doesn't matter, you know. There are people who do cross over and do wonderful things.
Absolutely.
And that's always a test, you see, in the Catholic and Orthodox Christian traditions. It's what these individuals do with their lives that makes all the difference. So if somebody's having these experiences or claiming them, and then they live a life that is not compatible with the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and they start carrying on in some way or abusing others, then it's pretty clear that they're not the genuine article. And for every real mystic in Christian history, there have been many people who try to fake it, try to convince others that they are.
Of course, there's always going to be those situations, and I imagine, from a Christian perspective, there could be experiences that appear mystical and appear to be otherworldly and heavenly, but aren't coming from God or aren't being.
Well, we can
which is another episode.
Yes,
in and of itself as well.
Yes, these Christian mystics, when they cross over into the other dimension, it's not just the good stuff that they encounter. And that's part and parcel of, Christian belief that, yes, of course, there's a God, but there are also evil creatures, evil angels.
As it has been written, if there's light, there has to be dark.
Well, we can get back to this, but mysticism is full of opposing experiences, paradoxically conjoined, such as experiencing evil and experiencing ultimate goodness when you cross over. And there are many dichotomies, body, soul, natural, supernatural, so on and so forth. But all of these paradoxes are always resumed in the mystical experience, where you can end up having the coincidence of opposites. So a paradox is no longer a paradox. And I guess, one of the more important ones in Christian mysticism is the paradox of God being divine and human because of the incarnation. Jesus was fully divine, fully human. How does that make sense? Or the Trinity. Trinity is there's one God, but 3 persons in one God. All of these paradoxes are resolved in a way that can't be explained.
Fascinating. Well, Carlos, I think we've gotten a pretty good idea of what mysticism is and how we're going to address it and talk about it in the coming episodes of the podcast. There's a lot to digest in what we've talked about, but I think our listeners get a pretty good idea of where we're coming from and who we're going to be talking about and what we're going to be talking about in the coming episodes of the Christian Mysticism Podcast. So what are you going to have for us on the next episode, Professor?
I think it's just natural to move on to the issue of, what is Christian mysticism? Where does it come from? Where can the origins of Christian mysticism be found? And how has Christianity been mystical for 2 millennia? So we'll have to get into the issue of, it's kind of a genealogical question of the Jewish roots of Christian mysticism, as well as the non-Jewish philosophical roots of mysticism. Many people don't realize this. They might have been exposed to, Greek philosophers in their education at some point as philosophers, but many of these Greek philosophers were actually mystics. So we have to dig deep and find these roots next time we talk.
That sounds exciting and interesting, and I know I can't wait to get back together with you to discuss it, and I'm sure our listeners will feel the same way. So until the next time we meet, I wish you the very best. A very happy New Year in 2023. Thank you all for listening to the Christian Mysticism Podcast. If you have any questions for Dr. Eire, you'll find our email address in the show notes. Just send it on over and we'll try to answer it in a future episode. And don't forget to click the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode of the Christian Mysticism Podcast.